at the History and Public Policy program here at the center, which I have the privilege of directing, is co-sponsoring with the National History Center and the AHA, today represented by the AHA's Executive Director, Jim Grossman. And Jim will momentarily introduce our featured speaker, Rachel Swarns from the New York Times, speaking about her new book. Let me hold this up. Yeah, American Tapestry, the Black, White, and Multiracial Ancestors of Michelle Obama. I'm delighted to welcome Rachel back to the Wilson Center. She was a public policy scholar here with the center in the fall of 2010. And so we're thrilled to have her back. And with that, let me turn it over to Jim, though not without saying that next week, at the usual time, we have Richard Carwadine from Oxford University on the history of Anglo-American relations. No?
No, he's going to talk about Lincoln and emancipation and his personal goals for those.
Even better. So that's the program for next week, but now over to Jim and Rachel.
I'd actually rather hear Carwadine talk about both Lincoln and emancipation and Anglo-American relations, because that would be fun. It's a pleasure to be here at the Wilson Center, and I want to thank Christian and the Wilson Center for generously hosting this seminar week after week after week. Much appreciated. I first met Rachel Swarns approximately 4 years ago, 5 years ago, when she was working on American Tapestry. I was struck by why she contacted me in the first place, which was that she wanted to get the history right. And I was even more impressed when we then subsequently met and to discuss her work. Too many people think that getting the history right means to have the facts checked and lined up properly. In the case, as you all well know, given the 150th anniversary of the Civil War over and over again, it often means whether you got the right number of buttons on a uniform. It often means whether someone arrived, in the case of what Rachel was working on in Chicago in November or October. And those things mattered to her, but more important was that she wanted to do more. She sought to figure out how the Great Migration and how Chicago's South Side created a context for this story, so that the tapestry actually did hang on a historical context. So I'm not surprised that she responded so positively to Marion Barber's invitation to participate in this seminar, where we try to think about the relationship between journalism, history, policy, and getting it right. Now, actually, to some extent, I misspoke here in terms of when I actually met Rachel, because I first met her without knowing, as many of you probably have, because she has been writing for the New York Times since 1995. Rachel has reported from Russia, Cuba, Zimbabwe, Angola, South Africa, and I suspect other places Guatemala, I believe, and probably other places that I don't know about, and has written about domestic policy and national politics, immigration, the presidential campaigns of 2004 and 2008, and to the point of her recent book, First Lady Michelle Obama and Her Role in the White House. For those of us historians who are accustomed to researching, writing, and teaching our specialties, that's a rather broad range indeed. And if this seems like a rather wide swath, you can also add her work at the Miami Herald before moving to the New York Times, where she reported from Haiti, Guantanamo Bay, and ranged widely domestically from racial violence in Los Angeles to the aftermath of Hurricane Andrew. So our speaker today is by no means a narrow specialist. She is someone who can put people and times and places into context, obviously, and I'm looking forward to hearing that.
Move out of the way here.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure to meet Jim back here again and to be back at the Wilson Center, where I spent I was trying to remember, 7 or 8 months. You see, we never want to leave. uh, Doing the research that led to this book. So I had a wonderful time here, wonderful memories, and I'm really grateful for the support. Jim Grossman was at the Newberry when I met him, and in Chicago, and wrote an important book about early migrants north, which was really helpful to me, as well as he introduced me to a lovely Thai restaurant near the Newberry, which I went back to many times when I was there, even after he had moved to Washington. We often view the election of Barack Obama as a powerful symbol of the way our nation has changed, a symbol of some of the broad demographic shifts that we have witnessed, as well as the shifts in viewpoint about race and identity, which led so many Americans to elect a black man to the presidency for the first time. The story of his origins became the dominant narrative of that presidential campaign. He was, we all remember, of course, the son of the white woman from Kansas and the black man from Kenya, and as some people like to put it, the physical embodiment of change. But his wife, Michelle Obama, whose family story was far less well known when she moved into the White House, is in many ways much more representative of the American experience and the history of this country. With her arrival, she became the first descendant of slaves to live in the White House as a member of the first family. And so this book that I wrote is the story of her family, but it's also our story, our history, as well as this tracing of the journey of her ancestors from slavery to the White House in 5 generations. I'm going to talk a little bit about how I got started and what I found. And I have to say, after spending time here, for the scholars here, I know that my talk will be a little unconventional. When I was doing my graduate work, I had a professor who told me, complimented me on my writing, but said, you know, I really was lacking in academic style. And when he showed me what he meant in terms of the formal ways of writing, I said, well, I don't think I'd have much of a job when I get back if I adopted too much of that. So I've gone to a lot of these talks, scholarly presentations, and I have to say I am not an academic. I am not a historian. I will talk a little bit at the end about sources and methodology, but I'm a journalist, so I hope you will make some allowances for it. And so how did this get started? It got started from my work covering Michelle Obama, the First Lady, and that in and of itself was something of an unusual assignment. Newspapers like the New York Times don't typically assign one person to write about the First Lady or the First Family. That's something that's typically done by the White House reporters who fly around with the president on Air Force One or chase him around the briefing room and write about the First Family and the First Lady when they have time. But there was a sense after that election in 2008 that we might want to do things a little bit differently. There was a sense that this family, this first African American family, living in this house built in part with slave labor, was going to be written about for generations to come. And newspaper reporters, we journalists, often like to think of ourselves as writing the first draft of history. And so there was a sense among newspapers, not only at the New York Times, but at others, that we should be involved in chronicling that. And so my editors in that November after that election came to me and said, you know, would you cover Michelle Obama and the girls and the president as first dad? And I said yes. And really the seeds of this book started germinating almost right away. In January, right before that first inauguration, one of my colleagues was working on an article about the president and his rainbow family. And at the very last minute, we realized we didn't know very much about Michelle and her ancestry, and so my colleague asked a genealogist to do some digging. And being journalists, we didn't give the genealogist enough time, and so she didn't do very much because she didn't have enough time. And the story ended up running about the president and his rainbow family with just a tiny bit about Michelle Obama. And we thought that was that. But unbeknownst to us, the genealogist got hooked. And she kept digging and digging and digging. And in the fall of 2009, of that first year that the Obamas were in the White House, she called us back. And she said, I think I found something really interesting. Would you guys be interested in writing about it? And we were interested. And so it was, I found myself on a plane to Birmingham, Alabama, where I spent hours in the archives and in courthouse basements and knocking on church doors, trying to find anyone who knew anything about a man by the name of Dolphus Shields, who was the First Lady's great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, who happened to be biracial. And the story ended up running a month later, in October, and it ended up being really the story of Dolphus's parents. His mother, Melvinia, the First Lady's great-great-great-grandmother, who was a slave girl valued at $475 in 1852, and the First Lady's great-great-great-grandfather, who was a white man whose identity was a mystery. And the story ran on the front page of the New York Times. There was a lot of buzz. This was news to the First Lady herself. And a day later, I got an email from an editor from a publishing house in New York saying, this is really fascinating, this snippet of the First Lady's family tree, her maternal line. Why not a book about the whole thing? And I have to be completely honest and say that my first reaction was absolutely not. I had never written a book before. I have young children. I have a mortgage. It was just hard for me to think how this was possible. And my husband said to me, please wait. Do not tell that lady no. And he reminded me of a story I told him when I came back from that first trip to Birmingham. I had gone to try and find the tombstone of Dolphus Shields, the First Lady's great-great-grandfather. And being a journalist, I was ready. I had been to the archives. I had all the paperwork. I knew what grave, what row. I knew who was lying next to him. I was prepared. And then I arrived at Shadow Lawn Memorial Cemetery. Some of you may know that back in the day, even the dead were segregated in the South. This was one of these old, neglected African-American cemeteries with the tombstones toppled and the grass up to my knees, and I spent hours there with my papers that were utterly useless, and at the end of the day came up utterly empty. But that afternoon, standing there, I thought to myself that there was really nothing I'd rather be doing than searching through the nation's history in that way. And I came back and told my husband and said, I don't know what this means. Maybe I get another master's degree. He said, maybe not that. But when this lady sent me this email, he said, maybe this is what it is. So I didn't tell the lady no, and I got started in January of 2010. And for my editor, it really was something of a leap of faith, because many of you in this audience have written many books, and I've seen some of these very nice detailed outlines, and I had nothing of the sort. I kind of wrote a letter that said, I'm sure it will be very interesting. But she thought it would be. And so I did what we do. I talked to as many historians as I could. I talked to members of the First Lady's family. I traveled around the country and spent a lot of time in archives and libraries and courthouses. The First Lady's ancestors are scattered all across the South, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and of course across the North too, as they moved, as many African Americans moved north. So Illinois, we know, but also Michigan, Ohio, some New Jersey. And somewhere along the way, I realized that I had both a fascinating family story, but really a very utterly American story. The First Lady's ancestors were African Americans who toiled on vast rice plantations in South Carolina. They were mixed race people who lived free for decades before the Civil War. And they were Irish Americans who nurtured their dreams in a new land and fought for the Confederacy. And I realized along the way that this story, this family, really served at least to me, and I hope to my readers, as a lens through which we could look back on some of this history. Melvinia, the First Lady's great-great-great-grandmother, and the First Lady's great-great-great-grandfather, the white man whose identity was unknown, really their story served kind of as the frame for it. But I quickly realized that you could see the breadth and depth of the American experience during that period of slavery. I'm going to read a short snippet from the book about Melvinia and her moving on and how kind of this history got lost over time. And then I'll talk a little bit about what I learned about this experience, very varied experience of slavery in her family. Nearly a decade would pass before Melvinia gathered up her children and headed north on her own. This is after emancipation. Black people walked then, sometimes for miles and miles on those dusty country roads, or squeezed onto the crowded, rattling railroad cars that chugged between small towns in rural upcountry Georgia. Sometime in the 1870s, Melvinia put some 60 miles between herself and her past. And somewhere along the way, she decided to keep the truth about her son's heritage to herself. People who knew her say she never talked about her time in slavery or about the white man who so profoundly shaped her formative years as a teenager and a young mother. She never discussed who he was or what happened between them, whether she was a victim of his brutality or a mistress he treated affectionately, or whether she was loved and was loved in return. She went her way and he went his, and just like that, their family split right down the middle. Their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, some black, some white, and some in between, scattered across the country as the decades passed, separated by the color line and the family's fierce determination to step beyond its painful roots in slavery. Contemporary America emerged from that multiracial stew, a nation peopled by the heirs of that agonizing time who struggled and strived with precious little knowledge of their own origins. Melvinia's descendants would soar to unprecedented heights, climbing from slavery to the pinnacle of American power in 5 generations. Her great-great-great-granddaughter, Michelle Obama, would become the nation's first African-American First Lady. Yet Mrs. Obama would take that momentous step without knowing Melvinia's name or the identity of the white man who was her great-great-great-grandfather. For more than a century, Melvinia's secret held. When I first learned about Melvinia, one of the things that struck me was how different her experience was from what I knew as a layperson about slavery. And, you know, we know as lay people, as just people who have learned our history, we often think about, at least I did anyway, about, Gone with the Wind, the grand manor, the big plantation. And Mrs. Obama's family does have that history. She has ancestors who lived in Georgetown, South Carolina, where these rice plantations sometimes had more than 200 people working and laboring on them. These were properties owned by, patrician members of society who, escaped the steamy malarial summers for Europe or New England, and who often occupied, prominent seats in the society, members of the state legislature, some members of Congress as well. So Mrs. Obama's family certainly did have that. Her family also, though, had this experience of free African Americans during this time as well. I mentioned these mixed-race people who lived free for decades before the Civil War. They lived in Virginia, right near the North Carolina border. They were mixed race, often described as mulatto in the census. And they were among the most privileged people in their society at the time. They were free, though it was a most tenuous type of freedom. They were required by law to register at the county courthouses. They could not vote. They were barred from education. It was a rural free population, too, which is quite different from the experience of free blacks in places like New Orleans or Charleston or Savannah, where you had often quite well-to-do, even some landed, educated people who reaped the benefits of privileges from white parents who chose to educate them somewhere along the way or leave them property. This community was nothing like that, and in fact, the dividing line between free and slave, while a real one, was not as stark as in other places. And in fact, even though the authorities barred intermingling between free and slave, members of the Jumper family were prosecuted for marrying members of the slave community. So there were those ties. And it's interesting, too, for a time I was very interested in trying to figure out how this Jumper family became free. And it's one of those things, as historians know, there are things that we just won't know. There are some tantalizing hints, though, from history. There was a woman by the name of Hagar Jumper who lived in a nearby county. Mrs. Obama's Jumpers were in Henry County and Pittsylvania County. This Hagar Jumper in the late 1700s, as this spirit of manumission and this wave of idealism spread after the Revolutionary War, she went to a courthouse and sued for her own freedom on the basis of her Native American ancestry, and she won. And her children and her descendants were free as a result. I was never able to conclusively determine whether Hagar's Jumpers were the same as Mrs. Obama's Jumpers, but it is certainly a possibility. So you have this range of experience in the First Lady's family, the vast plantation that's most familiar to us, and this free community of people trying to find their way. Melvinia and her children lived in a different place, a different setting altogether. She was enslaved, but on a tiny, tiny little place outside of Atlanta, in Clayton County, Georgia, a place where white men mostly worked the land with their own hands, and where slave ownership was not common at all. And even the men who owned slaves often worked alongside them. So it was a quite different experience. And some people often think when they hear about the Melvinia story about Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, which is a comparison that, of course, does come to mind. But again, they were among the most privileged of their groups, of course, Thomas Jefferson, and even Sally Hemings was among the most privileged of slaves. Melvinia and her owners were far removed from that. Her owners were from the Irish-American Shields family, who arrived in this country sometime in the 1700s. There is historical evidence to support the family story that at least one member of the family fought in the Revolutionary War. But they arrived in Spartanburg, South Carolina, sometime in the 1800s and then moved on to Georgia. And they were people who struggled and would not have owned slaves if not for the fact that Henry Wells Shields married the daughter of a wealthy man. And when his father-in-law died, he inherited 3 human beings, including the First Lady's great-great-great-grandmother, Melvinia. So all of this is fascinating history, yes. But one of the things that really motivated me was to think a little bit about how this history reverberates and resonates in contemporary life. We often think about history as, relegated, particularly this history, to the textbooks and kind of something that most people don't think about very often. But I have a feeling that we are this history is part of who we are, and I wanted to explore that. Mrs. Obama has long suspected, like many African Americans, that she had white ancestry. But like many of us, she had no idea who these ancestors were or where they fit into her family story. And with DNA testing, 21st century technology, I was able to solve the 19th century mystery in her family. And it was, of course, the most ordinary of stories, because Mrs. Obama's white ancestors came from the family that owned Melvinia. And I traced the descendants of Henry Wells Shields, and talking to some of those descendants, distant cousins of the First Lady, who are scattered mostly across the South, were Some of those conversations were some of the most powerful ones that I had during this reporting. And you can imagine what it might be like if a reporter from the New York Times were to give you a ring or knock on your door and say, by the way, your ancestors owned members of the First Lady's family. You know, some of us may like a connection to the White House, but that is not usually the one that we're looking for. Or worse still, that a member of your family, one of your ancestors, may have brutalized a member of the First Lady's family. And this was, this was difficult stuff for people. Some of these white distant cousins of the First Lady wanted nothing to do with me and my research. No one hung up on me. I would not have been offended. I'm a journalist, it happens. But they made it very clear that they wanted really nothing. They didn't want to be in the book. They didn't really want to talk about it, and that was that. Then there was a group that fell into a sort of middle category, people who were curious and wanted to know more, even though they didn't also want to appear in the book. These were people who were willing to share their family stories and their records, and in some cases their DNA. But these were also people who really wrestled with this information. Part of it was, as I mentioned, the Shields family, they were not wealthy people. And so their descendants, some of them had no idea that there was slave ownership in the family. They were astonished, in fact, and they said things like, well, but those Shieldses never had 2 nickels to rub together. How could that be? And one woman who was in her 60s went back to her mother, who was in her 80s, and said, Mama, could it be true? And her mother said it was true. And it was something that her mother had known, but she wanted that history to die with her. And then there was another group of people who, of these white distant cousins, who were willing to grapple with it, who openly, who said, this was not history they would have chosen, but it was their history, and they wanted to reckon with it. And so the story of some of these people are also interwoven through this. But the silence in the family is not something that was that I just found among white members of the family in terms of this particular time. Mrs. Obama's uncle talked about trying to talk to the elders in his family about what family stories there were about slavery, what people knew about the various shades of color in the family, what was the provenance of this ancestry. And people simply didn't want to talk about it. I was lucky enough, amazingly enough, to find 2 people who knew Melvinia. And that is really astonishing when you consider that she was born in 1844 or around. The birth dates are complicated. With folks who were enslaved. But she lived a long life into the 1930s. She died in 1938. And these people lived long lives too. One was the woman who married her grandson, who lived with her in the 1930s during the last years of her life. And another was a man who she brought into the world. After Melvinia moved north, a bit north, to Bartow County, Georgia, she became a midwife at some point, and this man who knew her was one of the people she brought into the world. And the 2 of them described Melvinia, a dark-skinned woman with 2 sons, Dolphus, who I told you about, and he had a brother named Henry, who were very, very light. Dolphus was described as near white, with no father, no husband and evidence, and no one talked about it. And one of the things I ended up feeling really strongly about in this research and in this writing was that, these connections sometimes have their roots in painful chapters in our history, but we need to talk about it. It is part of who we are. And I want to mention, obviously, slavery is indeed the frame of the work, and the story of Melvinia and Dolphus is kind of the frame of the book. But I do carry these folks from their period in slavery onward and follow their trajectory from wherever they happen to be in the South and as they move north. And so migration is a big theme in the book too. And of course, we all know about the Great Migration. But what I learned is that there were migrations within migration. You know, the migration north had periods within it. There was an earlier period and a later period. And the migration, when we think of the Great Migration, is often the biggest period. 6.5 million people, one of the largest movements of people on record from north to south. But most of that, you know, post 1940, you know. But even before, there were people who moved before. And even before people moved north, there were people moving. So the first movement really was people moving from small rural communities in the South to larger cities, to towns. And so Dolphus Shields, the First Lady's great-great-grandfather, is a perfect example of that. He lived in a tiny community, sharecropping community in Georgia, in Cartersville, Georgia. And in the 1880s, he moved to Birmingham, where people were flocking. It was a way where there was wage work to be had away from the fields. And he really carried the family from the sharecropping life to the working class. By 1900, he owned his own home. By 1910, he owned his own business. He was a founder of 3 churches, 2 of which are still up and running. And when he died, the news of his passing appeared on the front page of the black newspaper in Birmingham. And another ancestor of the First Lady, Carrie Tinsley, also had a similar migration, moving from a small town in North Carolina to a larger one, and then to Baltimore, and then to Chicago. So this history of migration is actually much more complicated than we realize. And as for the north-north migration, for those people who did move north, like Carrie Tinsley, Mrs. Obama's ancestors were early movers, which is why I was very interested to talk to Jim Grossman, because he kind of looked at that period before World War II and about these early migrants who were coming to Chicago. You know, Mrs. Obama likes to describe herself as a South Side girl, and she was indeed born and raised on the South Side of Chicago, as were her parents. But she and her immediate family had no idea how deep their roots ran. And her great-great-grandmother arrived in Illinois in the 1860s. Her great-grandmother, Phoebe Moten Johnson, who is one of my favorite characters in the book, was among the first of the First Lady's ancestors to see the skyscrapers of Chicago in 1908. And Phoebe actually lived in Hyde Park, not far from where the Obamas have a home today. And Jim and I actually drove around that neighborhood. The house no longer stands, but you could see where it was. So there was this theme of migration through her family. The other theme that you could see, too, is kind of the rise of segregation, which was fascinating to me. I sort of never thought about kind of how it came to be. But, you know, Dolphus Shields, the First Lady's great-great-grandfather, in 1900 had white neighbors in Birmingham. By 1910, but that was, you know, by 1910 he didn't, and he never would again. And his mother, Melvinia, also had white neighbors in Kingston, Georgia. And so through her family, you can kind of see kind of the lines hardening and the violence erupting as well. Where Melvinia lived in Bartow County, Georgia, there were several lynchings. Phoebe, the First Lady's great-grandmother, who I told you lived in Hyde Park, not far from where the Obamas were, lived through the riots in Chicago. And her family still has the story of, because blacks were being attacked, she had a large family. Her husband was an itinerant minister and Pullman porter who traveled all the time, and she was alone. That she got a pot and poured lye into it and boiled it on the stove and said she was ready if anyone came up to her door. But even in Hyde Park, moving to Hyde Park was something, you know, for an African-American family at that time. They were there by about 1918. And, you know, I talked to people who said, you know, you really had made it if you were you had moved to Hyde Park at that period of time. But it was not an easy entrance or an easy welcome. And in fact, there were white families and organizations that were bombing these newcomers. And Phoebe and her family actually ended up leaving Chicago for a time and coming back. And I wonder whether that searing period of time was part of it. You know, this book would not have been written if it were not for Michelle Obama, obviously. But one of the things, when I talk about it being a great lens for the American story, one of the things that I really loved about it was how familiar these people felt, and I think will feel to so many of you. My husband used to say, oh, please don't talk about these people. There are too many of them. And don't worry, there is a helpful family tree to help you sort them out. But they were really ordinary people. They were sharecroppers and farmers and teachers. They were domestics and railroad clerks and insurance agents and postal clerks who, bit by bit, moved their way forward, falling back at times, as they made their way forward. And so I think it really is powerful to me in that way. And you know, a lot of people will buy the book because it is about Michelle Obama. But what it really made me feel most strongly is how many of us have these kinds of stories in our own families. And I like to tell people I feel like I want to become, you know, a preacher of the gospel of genealogy. Like everyone in this room, you know, should be looking if you haven't already. And I think people are making these kinds of discoveries with DNA testing so readily available, some of these online tools like ancestry.com, and are coming to find out these things about their own families and making these connections. I am going to show you some photos and then talk a little bit about my sources and kind of how I pulled this all together. Okay. This is the first family, Mrs. Obama's first family anyway. That's Michelle Obama as a baby with her mother and her father and her brother, who, as many of you may know, is a basketball coach. This is Joan Tripple, who is a descendant of the man who owned Melvinia, who shared her story and her DNA. And this is Dolphus's great-granddaughter, who ended up living in Cleveland, Ohio. And the two women share their stories, and they are kind of the lens through which I tell the contemporary story. This is Dolphus's daughter, Pearl, who was the first of that generation, or among the first of that generation, to move north from Birmingham, and she ended up in Ohio. And that is Dolphus Shields, the First Lady's great-great-grandfather, who was biracial. He was born into slavery sometime around 1859, 1861, and he died in 1950, just as things were beginning to change. It's interesting, I mentioned the news of his death was on the front page of the black newspaper in Birmingham. That very same day, there was also a banner headline about the Supreme Court outlawing segregation on interstate train lines. And these are, I'm going to flip through these quickly. These are several photos of Dolphus Shields and his family. For a while, I did not have photos of the Shields family who owned Melvinia. And so these are tombstones of Henry Wells Shields, who came from Spartanburg to Georgia and inherited those human beings, including Mrs. Obama's great-great-great-grandmother and his son. This is the First Lady's paternal aunt with some photos. This is the First Lady's grandfather, who arrived from Georgetown, South Carolina, in Chicago in 1931. He was the golden boy of his generation, dreamed of being an electrical engineer, and landed right smack dab in the Depression, and things did not work out so well. This is Phoebe Moten Johnson, who I mentioned, who arrived in Chicago sometime around 1908, and her husband, who was away when the Chicago riots broke out. This is the First Lady's great-great-grandmother, Phoebe's mother, who arrived in Illinois in the 1860s. The family story goes that she was part Cherokee, and if you look at her, you could imagine, obviously, there's some mixed ancestry there, but I was never able to determine that conclusively. This was, I'm getting closer, this was the brother of Henry who owned the First Lady's great-great-great-grandmother, Melvinia. And actually, after the hardcover book was published, I got an email from a woman who said, oh my goodness, I had written an article adapted from the book in the New York Times, and she read that article. She said, oh my goodness, you know, I think those Shieldses are my husband's family, and, you know, we have a photo of them. I couldn't believe it, but it did turn out to be true. And so she provided the first photo of Henry Wells Shields and the White Shields family. And Henry Wells Shields is the older man with the white beard who is seated, and there's a little girl, and then his wife who is wearing a kerchief. And she was the daughter of the wealthy man who died, bequeathing them these 3 slaves. And the man who is looking off into the distance, who looks a little better dressed than some of the others with the mustache, is the man that the DNA testing suggests is most likely the father of Dolphus Shields. So it's the first time. In the paperback, we were able to include that photo, but I couldn't believe it. It was literally the week that my book was published. There was nothing I could do. And then 2 weeks after the book was published, the town of Rex in Clayton County erected a monument in Melvinia's honor. They had been working on this after that article that inspired the book was published. So they'd been working on it for 2 years, and the timing just happened to coincide. And so they invited descendants of Melvinia, and at the last minute, I thought maybe some of the White Shields family would like to come too. And they did. Some of them came from Georgia, some drove from Alabama, and they met and shared stories and photographs and had a meal together. I don't know that they'll be hanging out for years to come, but it was quite something to see. A bit about sources, and then and kind of how I pulled this together, and then I'd be happy to take any questions you would have. You know, I used you know, kind of the traditional things that you would if you were researching people long gone. So death, birth, marriage records. For African Americans who were enslaved, of course, you're also looking at property records or estate records. And in Melvinia's case, she first appears in the public record in around 1850 when her owner first writes his will, and she was a 6-year-old girl. It was clear he owned about 23 slaves, and he only mentioned a handful, including her. So, and she was a little girl, so it seems that someone in the family was fond of her, perhaps his wife, who he left her to. Census records, obviously, and for some of the free members of Mrs. Obama's family, they were helpful even before emancipation, because African Americans who were enslaved do not appear in the census until 1870. For that period, though, then you are really it's quite challenging because you've got fragments. As I mentioned, the Shields family was not a prominent family, and so they did not have a ton of records or journals, or they were not their comings and goings were not chronicled in the newspapers at the time. So for significant periods of time, I had to use kind of contemporaneous information from that time. So to give a sense of what Melvinia's life might have been like in Clayton County, Georgia after the war, I relied on Freedmen's Bureau records, for instance, that described what was happening in Clayton County, the number of people who were on rations, black and white, the drought that affected the area, the movement of people, free people trying to find and connect with loved ones who had been sold or sent elsewhere. I also relied on Southern Claims Commission records, which are really nice records because these are records that people filed looking for claims from the government because they lost property during the war. And these have affidavits of people, describing their experiences during the war and what they lost, And so you actually, get a sense of people's voice from that time. City directories were really helpful. Because those really kind of, I could track people over time, where they moved and what kinds of occupations they had. Slave memoirs, manuscripts. Some of the Civil War records were helpful. Some of the Shields. Henry's sons participated in the Civil War, so some of their Civil War records. For some of the African Americans who served in the war, some of the Civil War pension records were really great records because in some of those records, these are people, enlisted folks who are applying for pension. Sometimes their wives are applying for their behalf, but often, sometimes they include where they were enslaved and who their owners were. So those were really wonderful, wonderful records. Jim introduced me to a source which was just fabulous, these Sanborn fire insurance records. I'd never heard of them before. Historians here, of course, would be familiar with them, but they really recreate entire neighborhoods in color. I mean, they're drawings, but I could see where Phoebe lived in St. Louis before she moved to Chicago, and literally the block, and that she could walk how many blocks, to this church or to that store or this school, and how tall the building was. I mean, it was something else to see. Another source for Virginia records were a great thing called cohabitation records. After the war, people lined up by the hundreds to have their unions recognized legally as marriages. And some of those records, Mrs. Obama's relatives, ancestors in Virginia, they still survive. And they say, the names, the dates, of birth dates of people, as well as the owners, or whether they were free. So again, really important information. Family stories, of course, were really interesting and helpful, though there were some cautionary notes there. Phoebe, one of the early arrivals to Chicago, had a stepfather who was quite something. He escaped from slavery, joined the Union Army, had quite a storied time in terms of his service, and became a landowner, and just quite a man. And I interviewed Mrs. Obama's great uncle, who said, "Oh, Jerry Souter, yes, I know the name, Peg Leg Souter." And I thought, Peg Leg Souter, I love that, Peg Leg Souter. Lost his leg in the war, great. Except when I went to the National Archives to look up Jerry Pegleg Souter, I found his pension file, which includes a medical exam that you're required to have, and Mr. Souter had both legs. He did not lose a leg in the war. And it was one of those moments where I thought, oh, in journalism we used to joke about, don't let facts get in the way of a good story. But, it was one of those things I was sort of just floored, both legs. But on the other hand, it was, I could understand why such a story ended up being told about the guy. He really did have this amazing history, an amazing story. And another example of kind of some of the little finds that you have that really aren't huge things, but are meaningful. Most people who were enslaved had no idea exactly when they were born. And so in Jerry Souter's records, his Civil War, his military documents, they're under birth date, sometimes they just say kind of around how old he was. But later on with these pension records, when he was applying for a pension, all of a sudden there was certainty. There was an actual date. And I couldn't figure out for a long time where we went from this uncertainty to this firm date. And then I realized that the date was the date he enlisted in the Union Army. And I thought, he was reborn a free man that day, and that was the date he chose. And it's a tiny little thing, but it was very, very meaningful to me. So I want to thank you for your time and for your patience, and I would be happy to take any questions that you might have.
Great, thank you, Rachel. What a fascinating story. I know Jim has some questions, but why don't we open up the floor, and then Jim and I will chime in time. So, floor's open. If you could please, in Wilson Center tradition, wait for the microphone so the folks on the webcast can also hear you, and please state your name so that Rachel knows who she's talking to. Who goes first? All right, over here.
Thank you for doing this. I've long believed that.
Could you please introduce yourself?
Oh, sorry. My name is Judy Kennedy. I've long believed that the more people like you and I and others chronicle this generation's stuff, people who are debating immigration now will have a clearer lens through which to discuss options. And this sounds wonderful, and I'm excited to read it. The other exciting story that I thought came out of maybe it was Ancestry.com research, was that it may well be that the president's white grandmother, right, came from a mixed race family. And I'm just wondering if you've pursued that story at all.
I haven't pursued that. Am I?
Yep.
But it is fascinating. So, the son of the white woman from Kansas, it's a little bit more complicated, or so Ancestry.com, their genealogists suggest. What they found was that his mother was descended from a family, a mixed-race family. And in President Obama's book, where he talks about his own search for his identity, I think he mentions a Native American ancestor for which there was a great deal of kind of discomfort or shame. And sometimes Native Americans were cloaks. People said they had Native American ancestry to hide African American ancestry. And in this case, this family, and there are mixed race folks, and I can't remember, it was not my research and I didn't write about it. But, there's a long history of course, this kind of passing. And so, they actually also went further to say that they thought, and this was a little less, the kind of the lines between the dots were a little fuzzier here, but that they felt there was strong circumstantial evidence to suggest that this family, the African American that this family was related to, if you got far back enough, was the first person to be enslaved here. So.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Fergus Bordewick. Thank you, Rachel. I was startled that you discovered that the Shields family had owned 23 slaves, which must have been.
The Shields, Henry Wells Shields, married the daughter of a man who owned 23 slaves. His name was David Patterson, and he lived in South Carolina, in Spartanburg. And for Spartanburg, South Carolina, he was one of the wealthiest men of his times. Now, the Shieldses, Henry Wells Shields, who married David Patterson's daughter, was not a wealthy person.
Okay, well, that
Yeah.
pretty much answers my question, because I looked at that wonderful photograph you had with what was obviously
Right,
not a very affluent
That's right. That was
dwelling.
the Shields' family.
Yeah, and I was wondering what happened to the Shieldses as a result of the Civil War, and after. What was the impact on different members of the family?
It was interesting. Like I said, at least, and I'm straining my memory here, 2 or 3 sons enlisted, though they enlisted late. And Clayton County, Georgia was a county that did not overwhelmingly support secession. some of the northern, you know, areas in Georgia where it was not slave, not dominated by slave ownership, but by, you know, yeoman farmers, there was some hesitance about this. And so I don't know why they joined late, whether they had reluctance or what. One son died in the war. And after the war, they, you know, they lost a considerable amount of wealth because the slaves were free, and even though there were only 3 that made them among the wealthiest in that little community. The man who ended up being the one who the DNA suggests was Adolphus's father ended up becoming a teacher and moving a little bit, you know, to a neighboring county. His wife and he ran what was kind of, I guess, a rooming house. He, one of the interesting things about Melvinia was that she continued to have mixed-race children after the war. And so Dolphus, I mentioned, was born 1859, 1861, but in 1870, when she appears in the census, she has mixed-race children who were born after, when she was a free woman. And so for some members of the family, black and white, there's this kind of wonder or question or hope that could this have been something that was not born out of violence, or if it was, became something else. But we don't know whether they kept, there was any contact. And he died in about 1916.
It's interesting. I mean, as you notice, though, Adolphus's father clearly, in a way, doesn't belong in that picture.
He looks quite different.
He's dressed differently, and even his body language, as you noted, he's looking off. You know, everybody's looking toward the camera, but he's definitely not fitting. The family story goes that he was paralyzed in some way, maybe polio or something. Again, the rest of the family ended up being farmers. He ended up being a teacher, perhaps because he could not do the kind of labor, you know, the farm work. And so he may have been a bit different, you know, from his brothers.
David Nichols. I was wondering, when you say Irish, is that Irish Catholic or Scots Irish?
No, I was very curious about this. I don't know. They were Protestant for as early as I can find them. They were Protestant, and their descendants now say they don't have any. You know, they don't know of any Catholic origins. The Shields family were originally O'Shields, and you know, you can see them in the records. They lost the O. Sometimes they had the O, sometimes they didn't, and they ultimately lost it. But it's a good question, and I don't know for sure.
And also, I was curious about what reaction, if any, you got from Michelle Obama.
One of the very sad things for those of us who are writing books about the First Lady is that she has a strict policy of not doing any interviews for books at all. We believe that she's planning on writing her own book and probably has some good commercial advice that she should preserve her voice for her own book whenever she decides to write it. So I did not get a chance to talk to her. And I didn't also get a chance to talk to her mother or her brother. But aunts, uncles, cousins share their stories and their photographs, and I know that they found it fascinating, and so I hope she does too.
I would also imagine that by having a blanket policy, she's not choosing.
Right.
And
That's
that
right.
once she abandons the blanket
hard.
policy, then you have to say you, but not
Right.
you, and I would not want to be in that situation if I were her. So,
Yep.
When was Dolphus Shields born?
1859, 1861.
One of the things that when you say he may or may not have been the result of a violent interaction, John Hope Franklin's comment when the whole thing of the DNA about Sally Hemings and Jefferson emerged is really interesting in that regard. His argument was none of this matters. He owned her. He could do whatever he wanted. And arguably, it's the same thing with Dolphus Shields, that violence, in terms of one's definition of violence, the answer is he owned her. He could do whatever he wanted.
Right, and some members of the family felt that way too. How could, it's a slave owner and a slave, what kind of consent can there be?
Well, I'm curious. Is there another question?
Hi, my name is Beverly Gray. I was delighted with your presentation and the depth of your research. I am doing research on some shields in north central Georgia, and I was curious when you said that your shields were O shields before they became shields. Approximately when was that?
So if in some of the records in the 1800s in Spartanburg, South Carolina, you see records of O shields. By the time they arrived in Georgia, which is, they were there by 1850 and probably there a little before, they were just shields. What part of Georgia when you say central?
Jackson County.
Okay. They were in Clayton County and Henry County mostly. But there were a lot of Shieldses around, I noticed.
Yes.
I was often trying to make connections between various Shieldses. So, who knows?
And my shields traveled from Virginia in the late 1700s to Georgia.
To Georgia. Okay, interesting.
I look forward to reading your book.
Thank you.
So we're here at the Wilson Center, which is very consciously a policy institute. And so I'm curious as to how this story, which you've described as fascinating, and I think everybody at the table agrees, what are the policy implications of this? In other words, if many Americans learn this story, or learn stories like this, since as you've argued, this is a very American story, it's unusual only in that the end of it is the First Lady. What are their policy implications to us as Americans learning this story? Why does it matter that we know this story and didn't know it 30, 40 years ago or 10
I
years
think
ago?
the why it doesn't matter is easier than the policy question.
One may lead to the other, right?
In some ways, it's, the question of, how we see ourselves and who we are is an interesting one. And one of the things that was fascinating in the research was, how people were classified over time. So you had people like Adolphus Shields and other members of the family who, are mulatto in one census and Negro in other census and colored, and some were described as white in local records. The government, until 1930, there were all these different mulatto and other, it wasn't just black, white. There was a decision, a formal decision a policy decision to not describe African Americans as mixed race any longer. And there was some argument among black intellectuals that that was the right thing to do because questions of color and ancestry and privilege, which sometimes accompanied those things, divided up people, and there was a sense that perhaps there was strength in numbers. In some ways, some of these policy changes are happening in that way. The census now, respects and reflects a range of identities, no longer just, the 3 or 4. And so people can kind of check as many boxes as they like. So some of that, I think, is already taking place in terms of who we are as Americans. That's not a really direct answer to your question, but the best I could come up with. Yes.
Good afternoon. My name is Aaron Coleman, and I'm currently an intern with the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation. Me and my intern cohort, we often have discussions about what it means to be black and how that's different from other races, as in you might not necessarily know your lineage, like where you come from, your ancestors is just black. And, because of the records, it's hard to know how far it goes back. So I wonder what exactly are the implications or the knowledge that you think this book offers to a community who largely does not know their history?
It's it's interesting. You know, the president, obviously, who is directly, is a white mother, black father, chose still to check black, right? Even though we do have, he could have checked more than one box. And so that's a complicated question. It's a political question too. You know, there has been, I think, a feeling among some African Americans that, we don't want to go back to kind of dividing people up, and concern about kind of, biracial, multiracial, are those people going to leave us, I guess, right? And not be part of the collective. But I don't know. I think things are changing. They're changing a lot. I don't know how far it will go, but it's an interesting question.
And we don't know what box he checked in 1980, do we?
We don't.
We will find out in 2060.
I'm Sawyer from the Pulitzer Center. In answer to your statement about African Americans not knowing or being able to trace their ancestry farther back, I'm looking at this picture and thinking about children in Congo who are born out of rape, and thinking, how long will it be? How many generations need to pass before we might see a picture like this of, their children's children with descendants from the fathers who, come from different militia groups, and we don't know which groups. And I'm wondering if anything in your research would, or in your thinking about what you were writing about, would apply to them in any way. I'm sure it does. I don't know how.
I don't know that I have a great answer for you. Obviously, this experience of rape was not, it happened during American slavery. It happens contemporaneously during a lot of armed conflicts. And how the children are treated, the women are treated, I think varies a great deal, country by country. Out of this experience, mixed race children ended up being incorporated into the black community. And of course, they didn't have much of a choice about it either. But it would be interesting to kind of follow your question along to see where it would lead, but I haven't looked very much into anything like that.
And the optimism has to be tempered. The optimism implied there has to be tempered by your comment that many of the white descendants wanted nothing to do with you.
That's right.
So it's not as if
Right.
a majority necessarily of the white descendants had come to grips with,
No.
with this.
But some
Some
have.
have, right.
Yes, some have. Some did and some didn't. That's right.
DNA adds, I'm Landis
Just
Jones,
identity, yeah.
University of Louisville. DNA adds a new twist to all of this. Did you use DNA results that were shared by the cooperative people, or were you able to encourage people to get DNA testing that was useful for your work?
You don't ask the First Lady for her DNA. I knew that, I knew that Dolphus was her great-great-grandfather, and one of the things that happened in the migration, that happens often when you have these kind of movements of people of any immigration, is that families split, and Dolphus had many children. One line ended up in Chicago, one line ended up in Cleveland, Ohio. And the Cleveland branch of the family knew that there was a Chicago branch of the family, but over the years, they lost touch with the Chicago branch. And so they were astonished to find out that they had a cousin in the White House, and they did DNA testing. And then the descendants of Henry Wells Shields did DNA testing. And they all did it willingly. There was no, teacup snatch. I was aided by Professor Henry Louis Gates at Harvard, who has done this quite a lot for his programs on genealogy who, gave me advice in terms of testing companies' consent forms and just, the process to make sure that you're doing this in a way that is not going to create problems for you down the road.
Thank you. Anyone else? Comments or questions?
Hi, Fergus Borderwick again. Some years ago, I wrote about a group in North Carolina known as the Lumbees, who are today self-defined as an Indian tribe but don't meet any of the federal criteria for being an Indian tribe. But if you go back in history, that's to say the early 19th century, the same individuals, generation after census after census, are sometimes described, listed as mulatto, sometimes as Negro, and sometimes even as white. Who are these folks? They're a melange of fragments of various Indian peoples that disintegrated, runaway slaves, runaway white people, all kinds of people who are essentially hiding out. But my point in bringing it up is that it demonstrates that at an earlier time in our culture, these rigid definitions of race, the definitions of race were much more fluid, even as recently as the 18th century, and one could come up with other examples. And they weren't always as harsh, rigid, and unforgiving as they became in the 19th century. And I think you, like Annette Gordon-Reed with her Hemmings book, have done a huge service in cracking open this kind of collaborative not knowing, not wanting to know about the past shared by a lot of both white people and black people, and which you've talked about. And I think the implications for this kind of research are vast and far-reaching. And I guess I'm inviting you to say what you think the long-term, what long-term hopes you may have for the kind of work you've done in this book, and that other people as well are doing.
It's really interesting when you look back at some of these records and some of the classifications. Unlike today, you may or may not know, but it was a census enumerator who made the decision, eyeballing you. And so you would get some funny things like twins who the guy would say, okay, well, this one is mixed race and this one is black because one was darker than the other. But it really is fascinating, and the fluidity is interesting. There were people who, mixed race people who found legal ways to be, reclassified, which is interesting. I mean, we think about that. I spent time in South Africa, and during apartheid, there really was a whole system where you could get yourself reclassified if you felt you were improperly classified as African and you really were colored, and you could kind of change your identity through the system. I find it endlessly fascinating. I am back at the New York Times doing New York Times work, but I would love to continue, doing this kind of work. And I think it shows that really, speaking to your point too about this history, that we're all connected in. We're really all connected in so many ways, even though we don't often think of it in that way.
It's not always the eyeballing, because one of the things that happens is that if you look at, one of the fascinating things to look at is how these census instructions change, so that in some censuses they're eyeballing, and in some censuses they're asking. So, for example, there's a wonderful or fascinating case of a African-American woman in New York whose husband was white, but he was actually passing as black, as far as she knew. And the children are listed as Negro. When he dies and she finds out that he was white, in the next census they're listed as mulatto. So that's a case where the census taker was asking. So a lot depends on whether the census taker is asking or whether the census taker is eyeballing.
I think there are 9 million policy implications of your work. I can't resist pointing out that the New York Times reported just last week or the week before that we are in 2013 asking
I'm Yvonne Thayer. You also reported from Cuba, and I was interested in, of course, Cuba claims that they have no racial, don't distinguish between races in Cuba. It's a mixed society. And I was just curious from your other reporting and elsewhere where you've lived, can you comment about how other countries deal with race issues and compare that with how the U.S. deals with the race issue, which is a pretty big question, but I think you're a great person to answer it.
It is fascinating. You know, Latin America has, in some places, it's different. It's much, you know, I don't know how many categories Brazil has, but there are many, many categories. And you realize, as an African American woman, when you travel, you realize how varied definitions are. So I studied in Bogota when I was in college, and on my identity card I was trigueña, which comes from trigo, which is wheat colored. In South Africa, I was colored, I guess, to people. In one remote village in Zululand, I went to visit the mother of a friend, and when I drove up, all these children were coming and singing and around my car, and my friend was cracking up, and I said, why are you laughing? They're saying the white lady's here, the white lady's here. And so it just shows you, you know, we often see it as a very kind of fixed thing here, but, you know, sometimes people would say to you, why do you describe yourself as black? You're not, you're clearly of mixed race yourself. Of course, in an American context, these days, even these days, or at least I'm in my 40s, I'm a black woman, you know, regardless of, I do have mixed ancestry, of course, but so many of us do. So it is interesting to kind of see how it varies from place to place.
The whole idea that we should be looking back into our past and that can help inform us for our future in light of immigration, in light of a lot of political issues in this country. Are other countries, do they also make a point to look back into their history and the racial makeup of their country, and does it affect them politically the way it does us here?
South Africa is a good example, but it's quite different. I mean, they've obviously had a lot of reckonings in terms of history and apartheid. And it was interesting, you know, I don't know that, you know, I'm not sure to what extent, and I've been, I left South Africa 10 years ago, and so I was there, I arrived 4 years after apartheid ended, and you know, things were changing, and I'm sure are still changing. People still, though, very much identified with their groups. When I was there, you know, if you were Indian, you were Indian. If you were colored, you were colored. If you were white, you were white. And people had a sense of pride in that. And in fact, I met one guy in Cape Town who was kind of confused by these ideas of race that we have, and he said, well, so in America, you're black. I said, yes. He said, well, and you think of yourself as black? I said, yes, I do. And he said, okay, well, you know, you guys over there, you've done really well considering that you have no history. And I thought, oh, it was fascinating. I was enormously offended, but in his, he viewed me as colored, as a mixed race person, and history and being African to him meant language. It meant, you know, a whole history of tribal, you know, identification and belonging and history attached to that. And you know, he viewed me as kind of this, you know, mixed race, lost people in America, doing well despite the fact that they have no idea who they are. But I don't know how people are wrestling with that now. When I was there, people did seem still attached to those apartheid labels.
I think that's where you're getting into some of the policy issues, because what you're now moving towards is what we think history is. And in the next 6 months, they will be releasing the Common Core standards for social studies. and one question about whether one thinks what you've been talking about is important as well as fascinating would have implications in terms of how we then look at those Common Core standards. There is debate within one committee in the Congress right now about how research funding gets determined, what the locus of determination is for research funding, and the question about what's important research and what's not important. So I think that there are, once you get to the question you just posed, which is what history is, then the policy implications of this, I think, become very important.
My name's Isadora Hare, and I was born and raised in South Africa. I've been here quite a long time, but I still regard myself in certain ways as South African. And under apartheid, as you know, and as you stated, everybody was classified in one of four, I guess, classifications. But the differentiation between people went far deeper than that. And I regret to say that even at this advanced age that I've reached, I find myself at times when I meet new people thinking to myself, well, what are you? Are you this or are you that? Within the white group, for example, you were either English or Afrikaans speaking, or you were Jewish. And that was how the white group was further differentiated. Among the black group, as we know, the nationalist government tried to enforce the tribal identification. They tried very hard to kind of split the black group in terms of their tribal affiliations, and so on and so on, even though the Asian group was very small. I'm not talking about the Indians. Well, there again, if you were Indian, you were Indian. If you were Chinese, you were what was called Asiatic at that time, and many things depended on that classification, primarily how much money you could earn in a particular job.
And housing, where you
And
could live.
certainly in housing. I do think that that is starting to break down, but I think that because the roots go so deeply, it will take quite a long time. But immigration, I think, will be making a difference, both there and here, because I wonder, those children, for example, who were born in Vietnam of African-American GI fathers, how are they classified? Are they also automatically classified as black?
Are you talking about, would African Americans consider them black, or who?
Or themselves.
Or themselves.
Or whoever.
It's identity. It's such a complicated question.
It is.
It's interesting because African Americans often do what you're describing in terms of sometimes we see someone and you think, well, there's something there.
Yes.
You know?
Right.
That's a black person there. You know. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's complicated history there. I know there's been some issues of acceptance within those countries with the GI fathers. It's not been an easy road.
Okay, I think a fascinating and important set of questions we've wrestled with this afternoon, and we're all, I think, profoundly indebted to and thankful to Rachel for raising these questions. Congratulations on your book, and let's continue the conversation outside over a glass of wine. Not before we give a round of applause to Rachel. Thank you.